sold, betrayed, abandoned. Elena Carter was just a girl when her stepfather traded her away like property, believing she had no future of her own. But what happened next shocked everyone. Instead of breaking, she rose from the ashes, turning pain into power. This is a story of survival, revenge, and ultimate triumph. But the past is never truly gone. What happens when it comes knocking again? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe now so you never miss another powerful story. The house had never been this quiet before. Even in the stillness of night, there had always been noise. The soft murmur of her mother's voice, the rustling of fabric as she moved through the halls, the faint lullaby she sang just for her. But now, there was nothing. Silence pressed against Elena like a heavy weight, suffocating, absolute. She sat on the edge of her bed, gripping the thin blanket as if it could hold her together. The air still carried the faint scent of her mother's perfume, though it had begun to fade, much like her voice had faded in those final days. Elena had watched helplessly as sickness stole her warmth, her strength, her life. Her mother had always been her shield, the single force that kept the darkness of this house from swallowing her whole. Now she was gone, and in her absence, the truth of her reality loomed larger than ever. Her stepfather, Frank Carter, had never hit her, never even raised his voice. But his cruelty wasn't in what he did, it was in what he didn't do. He had never looked at her, not really, never spoken her name with anything other than cold indifference. While her mother had lived, he had kept up the pretense of being a provider, food on the table, a roof over their heads, but it had never been for them. It had been for the illusion of a respectable man, a generous husband. And now that the one thing tethering him to that illusion was gone, so was his need to pretend. The day after the funeral, the house had changed. Her mother's belongings had vanished. Her dresses, her favorite chair, even the small framed photographs she had kept on the mantel, gone, as though she had never existed. Frank had done it swiftly, methodically, without emotion. When Elena had protested, had begged to keep something, anything, she had been met with nothing but an empty stare. "This is my house," he had said flatly. "You will live in it by my rules. If you don't like it, you're free to leave." It had been a cruel joke. He knew she had nowhere to go. Days passed in a dull, suffocating rhythm. There was no school anymore. Frank had taken her books, stripped her room down to bare necessities. She was given food only when she asked, and even then it was in meager portions. The walls of the house, once familiar, now felt like a prison closing in around her. She moved carefully, afraid that even the sound of her footsteps might earn her another cold, unyielding gaze. And then, one evening, everything changed. She had been sitting in her room when she heard it. Her name, spoken without warmth, without familiarity. Frank had never called for her before. Hesitantly, she crept downstairs, her pulse a tight drumbeat in her ears. He was waiting for her in the sitting room, but he wasn't alone. A man sat across from him, older, with deep-set eyes and a face lined with years of experience. His suit was impeccable, his shoes polished to a shine. He looked like he belonged to a world far removed from hers. And yet his gaze was on her. Elena froze in the doorway. Something inside her screamed at her to turn, to run, though she knew there was nowhere to go. Frank gestured toward her. "Come in." Her legs moved before she could stop them. She stepped forward, every nerve in her body alight with a warning she couldn't ignore. The older man studied her for a moment before speaking. "So, This is the girl. Not his girl, not his stepdaughter, just the girl. Something cold curled in her stomach. She turned to Frank, searching his face for an explanation, for anything that might make sense of this. His expression didn't change. "I've made arrangements for you," he said. "Arrangements." Her mouth went dry. "For what?" "You'll be leaving tomorrow." "Leaving?" The word settled like a stone in her chest. She hadn't asked to leave. She had nothing, but at least here, she still had the echoes of her mother's presence, the remnants of a life that had once felt safe. "I don't understand," she whispered. The man stood, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "You don't have to." Something inside her snapped. She clenched her fists, planted her feet. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Frank smiled. It wasn't warm, it wasn't amused. It was the smile of a man who had already won. "You don't have a choice." The room tilted, the walls pressed in tighter. Alina's gaze darted to the door, the hallway, the stairs. "If I run now, maybe—" The older man shook his head, as if reading her thoughts. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, girl. Tomorrow." She had until tomorrow. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing in circles. She thought of her mother, of what she would have said, of what she would have done. She thought of the father she had never known, the one her mother had spoken about in soft, wistful tones. She thought of the version of herself that had once dreamed. Dreams that now felt like distant, impossible things. Morning came too soon. She wasn't given time to pack. There was nothing to pack. Frank didn't say goodbye. He didn't watch as she was led out of the house and into the waiting car. She did not look back. The door shut behind her with a quiet finality, and the car pulled away from the only home she had ever known. Victor Lancaster, the man who now owned her, sat beside her in silence. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her beyond the orders he had given the driver. "You will not speak unless spoken to," he said finally, his voice low, emotionless. "You will do as you are told." His words wrapped around her like chains. "You belong to me now." Elena turned her face to the window. The streets she had walked her entire life blurred past, swallowed by the horizon. The road stretched ahead, endless, unfamiliar, leading her into a future she had no control over. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to fight. But she did none of those things. Instead, she sat rigidly in her seat, nails digging into the fabric of her dress, and watched as the world she had known disappeared behind her. The sky was gray, heavy with the weight of something impending. The road beneath them turned from pavement to gravel, the crunch of tires a relentless, rhythmic sound. She stole a glance at the driver, his hand steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable. He carried himself with a quiet detachment, as if this were just another routine job. Perhaps it was. Perhaps he had done this before. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She would not break. Not yet. And the car finally slowed, her pulse quickened. The trees parted, revealing a long driveway leading up to a massive estate. Its grand facade loomed against the darkening sky, its tall windows like watchful eyes. The car came to a stop. No one moved. The driver stepped out first, walking around to open the door on her side. Elena hesitated. Victor did not move, did not acknowledge her at all. as if she were already no longer his concern. A cold wind rushed in as the door opened, biting at her skin. She forced herself to step out. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she willed them steady. The ground was hard beneath her feet. The weight of the unknown pressed down on her shoulders. She turned her gaze to the house, to the heavy wooden doors that stood closed before her. Somewhere beyond them, he was waiting. The man who now owned her. A voice inside her whispered that she should run. She knew better. There would be no escape. Not yet. The house was enormous, its sheer size swallowing her as she stepped past the heavy wooden doors and into the grand foyer. The chandeliers above cast a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors, but there was no warmth to be found here. Everything about this place was pristine, controlled, like a museum display where nothing truly belonged to the people who lived within it. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and something floral, but it did nothing to soften the cold unease settling in her chest. Victor Lancaster moved ahead of her without so much as a glance in her direction. He walked with a quiet authority, his footsteps deliberate, measured, as though he had already calculated every possible move she could make and planned accordingly. Elena trailed behind him, stiff and wary, her pulse thudding in her ears. She wasn't sure if she was expected to follow, but she did, because what other choice did she have? As they moved deeper into the house, the silence stretched, thick and unbroken. No voices, no distant laughter, no signs of life, just the vast emptiness of wealth. Victor stopped at the base of a grand staircase, his hand resting on the ornate banister as he turned to face her. "You will not be a prisoner here," he said, his voice as unreadable as his expression. "Not unless you make yourself one." She tensed. The words were strange, unsettling. He spoke as if he were offering her something close to freedom, but there was an edge to it, a quiet warning she could not ignore. "You will have your own room. You will be given everything you need," he continued. "I have no interest in controlling you." She didn't believe him. How could she? A man who bought her now claimed he had no interest in keeping her under his thumb. It made no sense. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Then why am I here?" His gaze held hers for a long moment, calculating. "Because I knew what would happen to you if I didn't take you." She wanted to press further, to demand to know what exactly he had saved her from, but something about the way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, made her hesitate. He wasn't lying, at least not entirely, but the truth remained just out of reach. A puzzle with missing pieces she had no way of finding yet. Before she could say anything else, he turned away, ascending the staircase with that same effortless control. "You should rest," he said over his shoulder. "Tomorrow we will talk." And then he was gone. Elena stood frozen in place, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house loomed around her, vast and unfamiliar, and she felt impossibly small within its walls. A quiet movement drew her attention. A woman stood in the doorway of an adjacent hall, watching her with careful eyes. She was in her 30s, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, her features sharp but not unkind. There was something in her gaze that made Elena uneasy. Not hostility, not sympathy, but something in between. "You should follow me," the woman said finally. "I'll show you to your room." Elena hesitated but nodded, trailing after her through the dimly lit halls. The woman walked briskly, speaking as she moved. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I run this house. If you need anything, you ask me." Elena absorbed the information in silence, noting the stiffness in Clara's tone. She wasn't rude, but she wasn't welcoming either. They reached a door at the end of a corridor, and Clara pushed it open, stepping aside. "This is yours." Elena stepped inside cautiously, taking in the space. It was large, far too large for someone like her. The bed was massive, covered in expensive-looking linens. A vanity sat against the wall, a wardrobe against another. There was even a sitting area near the tall windows, which overlooked the vast estate grounds. It was beautiful. It was a cage. Clara watched her reaction, arms crossed. "You have everything you need here: clothes, toiletries, books. If you require anything else, you'll have to ask Mr. Lancaster directly." Elena turned to her, her voice tight. "Why did he bring me here?" Clara's expression didn't shift. "That's a question you'll have to ask him yourself." A beat of silence. Then Clara reached for the door handle. "If you need anything tonight, don't go wandering. This house is large, and you don't want to find yourself in places you shouldn't be." Elena's stomach twisted at the quiet warning. Before she could say anything, Clara stepped out, closing the door behind her. Elena was alone. For a long time, she stood in the center of the room, her hands clenched at her sides. She should have felt relief. No one had hurt her. No one had locked her up. She had been given a beautiful room, clothes, freedom to move, but she didn't feel free. She felt watched. She moved to the wardrobe, pulling it open. Inside, the clothes were pristine, luxurious. Soft blouses, flowing dresses, coats made of expensive material. Everything looked like it had been chosen specifically for her. Her fingers trailed over the fabric, a bitter taste forming in her mouth. How long had he been planning this? She turned away from the wardrobe, crossing to the windows. The glass was cool beneath her fingertips as she peered out into the night. The estate stretched on endlessly. Gardens, a fountain, even a long gravel driveway leading to a set of iron gates in the distance. She thought of running. But where would she go? She exhaled sharply and turned away, moving to the bed. She didn't undress, didn't bother slipping beneath the sheets. She simply lay there on top of the covers, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Sleep didn't come. When morning arrived, she found the wardrobe doors slightly ajar. She was certain she had closed them the night before. A chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it, pushing herself up from the bed. She wouldn't show fear. Not yet. Dressing quickly, she stepped out of the room, the hallway eerily silent. She hesitated before heading in the direction she thought led back to the main part of the house. The halls were lined with paintings, men and women frozen in time, their painted eyes following her as she moved. The house was stunning, but there was something off about it. Something she couldn't quite place. She found the dining room by accident. The long table stretched on endlessly, polished to perfection. At the far end, Victor Lancaster sat, a cup of coffee in hand, watching as she entered. "You're awake," he said simply. Elena hesitated at the doorway. A servant appeared beside her, silent, efficient, gesturing for her to sit. She moved cautiously, taking a seat across from Victor, her back stiff. A plate was placed before her: eggs, toast, fruit. It was rich, heavier than what she was used to. For a moment, she only stared at it. "Eat," Victor said, sipping from his cup. She didn't move. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust any of this. Still, the hunger gnawed at her stomach, and after another moment of hesitation, she picked up her fork and took a bite. The food was good. Victor said nothing as she ate, simply watching her with that same unreadable gaze. When she was finished, he finally spoke. "I suppose you have questions." She did. 1,000 of them, but none of them found their way past her lips. Victor studied her for a long moment before setting his cup down. "I bought you because I could." Her stomach turned. He continued. "Because I knew what would happen to you otherwise." She clenched her fists beneath the table. "You expected something worse." It wasn't a question. Her silence was answer enough. His expression remained unreadable. "I have no need for a servant, no need for a wife, no need for anything you might assume." She forced herself to speak. "Then why?" A pause. Then, softly, "Because you deserved better than what was planned for you." She didn't know what to do with that. No one had ever told her she deserved anything before. She wanted to believe him. She couldn't. Victor pushed a small envelope across the table toward her. Elena hesitated before picking it up, her heart pounding as she slid it open. Inside were documents, paper, proof of ownership, a house, a bank account, money. Victor leaned back in his chair. "I've given you a future. What you do with it is your choice." Elena stared down at the papers in her hands. For the first time, she realized something terrifying. He wasn't keeping her here. He was letting her go. Elena stared at the envelope in her hands, its weight far heavier than mere paper should have been. The documents inside, proof of ownership for a house, a bank account filled with more money than she could comprehend, felt unreal. This wasn't a gift. This was something else. A transaction that didn't quite make sense. Victor Lancaster sat across from her, his expression unreadable as always, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest of his chair. "Take your time to decide," he said, his voice level. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she set the envelope down carefully, as though it might burst into flames. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists beneath the table, willing herself to stay calm. She wanted to ask him why. Why give her this? Why let her go? If he had wanted a servant, a pawn, or something worse, he had her. And yet, he was giving her the very thing she had never thought possible. Freedom. She didn't trust it. "If I leave," she said slowly, testing the words, "I won't come back." "That is the only condition," Victor confirmed. A trick. It had to be. No one gave something for nothing, especially not men like him. She had learned that lesson early in life. Still, he made no move to coerce her, no attempt to bind her to him. He simply sat there, waiting, letting her weigh the choice for herself. For the first time in as long as she could remember, her fate rested in her own hands. That night, she couldn't sleep. She paced the length of her room, her mind tangled in 1,000 thoughts. This was what she had always wanted. Escape, the chance to be free of men like Frank Carter, like Victor. And yet, now that it was within her grasp, she couldn't stop the gnawing unease in her gut. If she walked away, if she truly left, then what? The world outside these walls had never been kind to her. She had no education, no experience, no family, a house, money. It was more than she had ever dared to dream of. But she knew that survival wasn't just about having resources. It was about knowing how to use them. Would she be walking into another kind of cage? One built of uncertainty and isolation instead of walls and iron gates? Morning arrived too soon, sunlight spilling through the tall windows, casting golden light across the room. When she stepped out into the hall, no one stopped her. No guards, no locked doors, no final test of obedience. only the vast, empty house, waiting to see if she would truly leave. At the front entrance, Clara Whitmore was waiting for her. The housekeeper's expression was, as always, unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that told Elena she had been expecting this moment. "There's a car waiting outside," Clara said. "It will take you wherever you wish to go." Elena hesitated. "Do you know why he did this?" Clara studied her for a moment before responding. "Mr. Lancaster rarely does things without reason." That wasn't an answer, but it was all she was going to get. With a steadying breath, Elena stepped outside. The wind was sharp against her skin as she crossed the gravel driveway. The car waited at the end of the path, its engine a quiet hum. The driver, a man she had never seen before, stood by the open door. She glanced back at the house one last time. Victor wasn't there to see her off. Good. She climbed into the car, the door shut behind her, and just like that, the estate faded from view. The city was different than she remembered. Busier, louder, filled with an energy that felt foreign to her after weeks spent in the quiet isolation of Victor's estate. The buildings stretched tall, people moved with purpose, and she felt like a ghost drifting between them, untethered. The house Victor had given her was smaller than his mansion, but by her standards it was enormous. More space than she knew what to do with. The first night inside, she sat on the floor of the empty living room, surrounded by walls that didn't yet feel like her own. It didn't feel real. She was alone, truly, entirely alone. No stepfather watching her every move. No benefactor offering cryptic words and unreadable motives. No one at all. The silence pressed in on her, heavier than she had anticipated. For so long she had fought for this moment, to be her own person, to live on her own terms. And now that she had it, she didn't know what to do with it. The first few weeks passed in slow, careful steps. She learned the streets, the bus routes, the way the city breathed. She went to grocery stores, memorized prices, figured out how to cook something more than the scraps she had once been given. But there was still an emptiness inside her. She wasn't meant to just survive. She had spent her entire life waiting for orders, waiting for permission, waiting for someone else to dictate her future. No more. One evening, she found herself standing outside the gates of the university. It had been a dream once, back when dreams had seemed impossible things. She had wanted to learn, to study, to build something for herself. And now, she could. The process of enrolling was overwhelming at first. Papers, fees, forms she didn't understand. But she was relentless. She found the answers, pushed through the barriers, refused to let herself be turned away. The first day of classes, she sat in the back of the lecture hall, surrounded by students who had always belonged in places like this. She didn't. Not yet. But she would. She buried herself in books, studied late into the nights, absorbed everything she could. And yet not everyone wanted her to succeed. The whispers started first, quiet, mocking. She wasn't like them. She didn't belong. And when words didn't work, they tried other things. Ink spilled across her notes. Assignments mysteriously disappeared. A professor who looked through her like she wasn't there. For a moment, she almost let it break her. But then she remembered. She had survived worse. She had survived men who had tried to own her. She had survived silence, hunger, fear. She would survive this too. So she stayed. She fought. She spoke up in class. challenged ideas, refused to let them ignore her. One day, a girl who had always watched from afar approached her. "You're braver than they are," she said, pressing a new notebook into her hands. A simple act of kindness. But it meant everything. Slowly, the whispers faded. Slowly, she found her place. A year passed, then another. She no longer hesitated when she stepped outside. She no longer feared the weight of expectation. She was no longer surviving. She was thriving. And for the first time in her life, she was free. The night was cool, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Elena barely noticed. She was exhausted, the weight of the day pressing down on her as she unlocked the door to her house, stepping inside and closing it behind her. The silence wrapped around her like a second skin. Once it would have suffocated her. Now it was a comfort. She dropped her bag by the entrance and exhaled slowly, rubbing the tension from her temples. Her business had taken up most of her energy that day. Meetings, negotiations, numbers that blurred together after staring at them for too long. But she had built something real. She moved through the familiar space, her fingers tracing along the wooden surface of the dining table. This house, this life, it was hers. No one had given it to her. Not Victor, not Frank, not fate. She had carved it out with her own hands. Then came the knock, a sharp, deliberate sound that sent a jolt down her spine. Elena froze. Few people came to her house unannounced. Fewer still would knock with that kind of certainty. She turned, staring at the door as if it might disappear. Her pulse had already quickened, but she forced her breathing steady. Another knock. Firm. Expectant. She had spent years waiting for this moment, the inevitable return of the past. She crossed the room slowly, each step measured, until she reached the door. Her fingers hesitated on the handle before she finally pulled it open. The sight before her was both unfamiliar and painfully known. Frank Carter stood on her doorstep. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years had not been kind to him. His face was thinner, his sharp features now exaggerated by age and something else. Bitterness. The man who had once towered over her, who had filled her childhood with cold indifference and quiet cruelty, now looked smaller. His clothes, once meticulously maintained, were worn, his shoulders carrying a weight she did not care to understand. But his eyes were the same. Cold. Calculating. Elena said nothing. Then Frank smiled. It was an ugly thing, an attempt at warmth that never quite reached his eyes. "You've done well for yourself," he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. She didn't return the sentiment. She didn't invite him in. She didn't even blink. "What do you want?" Her voice was steady, sharper than she had expected. Frank raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Is that any way to greet family?" The word sent ice down her spine. Family. She almost laughed. Instead, she met his gaze with something colder than steel. "You sold me." His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "And yet here you are, thriving," he mused. "You should be grateful, grateful." The word twisted in her chest, sharp and poisonous. She could have laughed, but there was nothing funny about this. She could have slammed the door in his face, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she watched him. She saw the way his gaze flickered past her, taking in the interior of her house, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides, itching to take something that wasn't his. And then she understood. You need money. It wasn't a question. Frank's expression tightened, just for a fraction of a second, before smoothing into something more controlled. Is that what you think? He said, shaking his head as if she had wounded him. I came to see how you were. I came to make things right. A lie. A hollow, empty lie. She had spent years waiting for an apology that would never come. And now, standing here, she realized something that should have been obvious all along. She didn't need it. She didn't need anything from him. You should leave, she said simply. Frank's smile thinned. You wouldn't even be here if it weren't for me, he said, his voice lowering. Elena tilted her head slightly. You're right, she said, her voice even. If it weren't for you, I'd still be trapped in that house. I'd still be afraid. I'd still be waiting for someone else to decide my fate. Her gaze didn't waver. But I'm not that girl anymore. And I don't owe you anything. For the first time, something in Frank's expression cracked. She didn't wait for him to respond. She stepped back and closed the door. The finality of it echoed through her chest. She stood there for a long moment, breath slow, steady. And then she turned away. The past had come for her, and she had shut it out for good. She did not expect him to return so soon, but she should have known better. Men like Frank Carter did not accept rejection. They did not take silence as an answer. They took. They demanded. And when they found resistance, they pushed harder. The first time had been a test, she realized. He had wanted to see how much of the old girl still remained in her, whether she would hesitate, whether she would break. When she had closed the door in his face, she had given him his answer. She was no longer afraid of him. That should have been enough to make him leave. But men like him did not know how to walk away empty-handed. She was at her desk when she heard the knock again. This time it was louder. Heavier. A demand, not a request. She didn't move at first. Didn't breathe. Just sat there, staring at the closed door. Listen. Another knock. She exhaled slowly and rose to her feet. When she opened the door, she was not surprised to see him standing there. But this time, he was not alone. A woman stood beside him. Younger than him, but with the same hardness in her expression. His new wife, she guessed. The replacement. Elena had never seen her before, but she knew her kind. The kind who latched onto men like Frank, not because they were blind to what they were, but because they thought they could benefit from it. The woman's gaze flickered over her, calculating. Elena held her ground. You didn't think we were finished, did you? Frank said. She didn't flinch. You need something, she said. His smile was sharp, pleased. We all need something, he replied. He shifted, stepping closer, as if he expected her to let him in. She didn't move. You owe me, he said. There it was. The words he had been waiting to say. The words he thought would bind her to him. She could have laughed. If it weren't so pathetic. I owe you nothing. Frank's smile didn't falter, but there was something behind it now. Something harder. You would be nothing without me, he said. I gave you a life. Elena stared at him, at the arrogance, at the absolute conviction that he still had power over her. She thought of the years spent beneath his roof, of the moment he had sold her, of the nights she had spent terrified of what the future might hold. And she thought of the life she had built, without him. You didn't give me a life, she said quietly. I built this myself, and you will get nothing from it." Frank's face darkened. The woman beside him tensed, shifting as if preparing for a fight. But she wasn't the one who mattered. Elena kept her gaze on him. "This is the last time we will speak," she said. "If you ever come back, if you ever try to take anything from me again, I will make sure you regret it." His jaw clenched. For the first time, she saw something almost like uncertainty in his eyes. "Good." She stepped back, and with steady hands, she closed the door in his face. This time, she knew he would not return. And if he did, he would not like what he found. The door shut with finality, the weight of the past sealed behind it. Elena stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence, waiting for something, some old fear, some lingering doubt to resurface. But there was nothing. No footsteps lingering on the other side. No second knock demanding her attention. Just silence. It was over. The realization settled in slowly, unfurling in her chest like something unfamiliar. It didn't arrive with a dramatic crash, no grand moment of celebration, just a quiet, steady understanding. She was free. And this time, it was forever. She turned away from the door, moving through the house that belonged to her and no one else. For so long, she had been bracing for this, for the inevitable return of the past, for the fight she knew would come. And now that it had, now that she had faced it and shut it out, she didn't know what to do with the space it left behind. For years, every decision she had made had been shaped by survival. Even when she had stepped into freedom, even when she had built her own life, there had always been a shadow lingering at the edges of it. She had been waiting, but no one was coming. She exhaled slowly, as if for the first time in years she could finally breathe without fear. The city stretched beyond her window, its lights flickering against the dark sky. It had once been foreign to her, something vast and unknowable. Now it was home. She had made it so. Her business continued to grow, stronger now than ever before. The weight of uncertainty had faded, replaced by something steadier, something unshakable. She no longer worked out of fear, no longer fought simply to prove she belonged. She knew she did. She expanded, taking on new projects, making connections she once never would have dreamed of. People respected her, sought her out for her skill, her knowledge. She was not an anomaly, not a charity case. She was a force of her own making. And she was not alone. The friendships she had formed in the university had not faded with time. The people who had once been distant classmates were now part of her life in ways she had never anticipated. They were colleagues, partners, friends, who knew her not as the girl who had been sold, but as the woman who had built something out of nothing. She no longer feared the quiet moments. She no longer filled them with ghosts of the past, with what-ifs and doubts. She no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps behind her, no longer waited for the inevitable collapse of the life she had created. One evening, as she stood in the doorway of her office, looking out at the city she had claimed as her own, she realized something she had never dared to hope for. She was happy, not in the way she had once imagined happiness, soft and fleeting, something given and easily taken away, but in a way that was steady, unshakable. She was at peace. She had won, and the life before her belonged only to her. The city was alive beneath her window, glowing with the pulse of neon signs and streetlights. Elena leaned against the frame, watching the cars move below, their headlights flickering like restless fireflies against the pavement. The hum of distant voices, the occasional sharp honk of a horn. It was all part of the world she had built for herself, a world she had earned. It had been 2 years since she walked away from her past. 2 years of late nights and early mornings, of carving a space for herself where none had been given. She had thrown herself into work, into studies, into becoming something more than the girl she had once been. And it had paid off. Her consulting firm, the business she had started as little more than an idea scrawled into the margins of a notebook, had become something real. It had started small, freelance work, helping businesses navigate the complexities of marketing, branding, strategy. But word had spread. People had noticed. Now she had a team. An office, clients who sought her out, not because they pitied her, not because they felt obligated to help a girl who had once been nothing, but because she was good at what she did. She was independent, she was successful, she was free. But freedom, she had learned, was a strange thing. For so long it had been her goal, the finish line she had strained toward in the darkness, the thing she had believed would fix everything. But now that she had it, now that no one owned her, no one controlled her, no one dictated her fate, she found herself wondering, what came next? There had always been something to fight against. The weight of her stepfather's cruelty, the fear of what Victor Lancaster might do, the struggle to prove she was more than what had been done to her. But now, the battles had shifted. They weren't about survival anymore. They were about what kind of life she wanted to live. Elena sighed, rubbing her fingers against her temples before stepping away from the window. She turned back to the sleek desk in the center of her office, the neatly stacked files and glowing laptop screen waiting for her attention. She had deadlines to meet, contracts to review, but for once, the thought of burying herself in work didn't feel like enough. She closed her laptop, grabbing her coat instead. The city called to her tonight. Outside, the air was crisp, a cool breeze weaving through the streets as she walked, her hands tucked into her pockets. The city had once felt too big, too unfamiliar, but now she moved through it with ease, knowing every shortcut, every quiet cafe, every hidden place where she could sit and think. She found herself at the bookstore near the market, the one she had first wandered into when she had barely known how to navigate life on her own. It was still the same, the smell of paper and old ink, the faint hum of quiet conversation, the rows of books stacked high like silent sentinels. Elena traced her fingers along the spines as she walked, letting them guide her without thought. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but the familiarity of it soothed her. It reminded her of who she had been, of the girl who had stood here years ago, hesitant, unsure, but hungry for knowledge. She had bought 3 books that day. Now, she owned shelves full of them. Still drawn to the classics? The voice was smooth, amusing. Elena turned, finding herself face to face with Mason Blackwell. He was leaning against the opposite shelf, arms crossed over his chest, a lazy half-smile playing at the corner of his lips. Dark-haired, sharp-eyed, dressed in the effortless kind of way that suggested he was aware of his own presence but didn't care to flaunt it. She hadn't seen him in months, not since their last meeting at a networking event, where they had spent half the night arguing over business ethics and the other half pretending they weren't intrigued by each other. She arched a brow. "Are you stalking me now?" Mason smirked. "If I were, I'd like to think I'd be better at it. But no. I'm here for work." He lifted a book from the shelf beside him. "One of my clients wants a first edition. Thought I'd try my luck." Elena glanced at the title. That's a reprint. Mason sighed dramatically. So, I've been told. Guess I'll have to keep looking. She rolled her eyes, turning back to the shelves, but he didn't move away. You look different, he said after a moment. She frowned. Different how? More at ease, he said, tilting his head slightly. More certain. Elena wasn't sure how to respond to that. She had changed. She knew that. The girl she had been. The girl who had been sold. The girl who had stood in front of Victor Lancaster, waiting for whatever fate had in store for her, was long gone. But there were still pieces of her buried inside. Still echoes of old fears, old doubts. Mason seemed to sense her hesitation, because he changed the subject easily, gesturing toward the book she was holding. That one any good? She glanced down, realizing she had grabbed something without thinking. She considered lying, telling him she had read it, but something about Mason Blackwell made her want to be honest. I have no idea, she admitted. His grin widened. Then let's find out. They left the bookstore together, stepping back into the rhythm of the city. She hadn't expected to run into him, hadn't expected the conversation to come so easily. But she didn't mind it. She wasn't sure what it meant, but for once, she wasn't in a hurry to figure it out. She had spent so much of her life chasing certainty, carving a future out of desperation, fear, and sheer force of will. Maybe now she could afford to let some things unfold on their own. As they walked, Mason nudged her lightly with his elbow. You ever think about what's next? He asked. She glanced at him. What do you mean? He shrugged. You built this life. You proved everyone wrong. But what happens now? Elena looked out over the city, the lights stretching endlessly into the horizon. What happens now? For the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. And for the first time, that didn't scare her. She smiled slightly, tucking her hands deeper into her coat pockets. I guess I'll find out. The sound of rain against the window was steady, rhythmic, a quiet metronome against the silence of the room. Elena sat at her desk, her fingers tracing the rim of a coffee cup gone cold, her gaze fixed on the city lights flickering beyond the glass. The office was dimly lit, the overhead lights off, leaving only the glow of her laptop screen to cast long shadows across the space. It had been another long day. Meetings, contracts, negotiations, a cycle she had once thrown herself into with relentless determination. But tonight, something felt different. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, willing herself to relax. She had everything she had ever fought for. Her business was thriving. The firm she had built from nothing had grown into something formidable, something that carried weight in circles that had once ignored her. She had influence. She had security. She had power. So why did it feel like something was still missing? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. It was past 10. No one should still be in the building. For a brief moment, something inside her tensed. A muscle memory from a life where unexpected knocks had always meant danger. But she forced it down, shaking off the irrational instinct. She stood, crossing the room with measured steps, and pulled the door open. Mason Blackwell stood on the other side. He leaned against the frame, dressed in his usual effortless style. Dark slacks, a button-down with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, his hair slightly tousled as if he had run his fingers through it one too many times. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "You're working late," he said. So are you, she countered, crossing her arms. He smirked slightly. Touche. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. Come in, she said. He did, moving with the kind of ease that suggested he was used to slipping into places he didn't quite belong, but somehow always made them his own. She closed the door behind him, watching as he took in the space. You need a break, he said, finally turning back to her. Elena arched a brow. Is that your professional opinion? It's my personal one, Mason said, leaning against the edge of her desk. You built this empire. You've proven yourself 10 times over. But you don't know what to do now that you're not fighting to survive, do you? The words landed sharper than she expected. She hesitated. Then, I've always had something to fight against. Mason nodded as if he understood. And now you don't. She didn't answer. Because she didn't have one. She had spent so long pushing forward, clawing her way out of the life she had been forced into, that she had never stopped to think about what came after. The idea of just existing, without struggle, without a battle to win, felt foreign. Mason watched her, his gaze steady but not unkind. You don't have to keep proving you belong here, Elena, he said. You already do. Something in her chest tightened at that. She wasn't sure why. She looked away, focusing on the city beyond the glass. Let's go somewhere, Mason said suddenly. She turned back to him, brow furrowing. Go where? Anywhere that isn't this office. She hesitated. Then, fine. The streets were slick with rain as they stepped outside, the air cool against her skin. Mason walked beside her, hands in his pockets, his stride easy, unhurried. Where are we going? She asked. You'll see. She rolled her eyes, but followed. They ended up at a small cafe tucked between towering buildings, the kind of place that felt like a secret in a city that never stopped moving. It was quiet, dimly lit, the scent of coffee and warm pastries filling the air. Mason ordered for both of them before she could protest, and minutes later they were sitting at a corner table, a soft jazz song playing in the background. You seem too comfortable here, she noted. Mason smirked over the rim of his cup. I have a life outside of work, Carter. You should try it sometime. She scoffed. I have a life? Do you? He challenged. Or do you just have success? She stared at him, something sharp twisting in her chest. I built this business, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. I made something for myself. Something no one can take away from me. I know, Mason said, and that's why I'm telling you that you don't have to keep proving it. She didn't realize she was gripping her cup too tightly until the ceramic bit into her palm. She loosened her grip, exhaled slowly. What if I don't know how to stop fighting? Mason leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now. Then maybe it's time to learn. She let his words settle, let them linger in the quiet space between them. Maybe he was right. Maybe she didn't know how to exist without the struggle. But maybe, just maybe, she could learn. For the first time in a long time, she let herself think about a future that wasn't just about survival. A future that was hers to shape, not out of necessity, but out of choice. The thought scared her, but it also felt like freedom. The city hummed around her, its neon glow casting shifting reflections in the puddles along the pavement. Elena walked without direction, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her breath curling in the cool evening air. She had left the cafe nearly an hour ago, but Mason's words still echoed in her mind. You don't have to keep proving you belong here. She had built her business, she had carved out a place for herself, and yet the battle had never really ended, not in her mind. Success had not silenced the ghosts of her past. She had spent so long running from what had been done to her, from the version of herself that had once been powerless, that she had never stopped to ask what she wanted beyond simply surviving. Now, for the first time, she had to decide what kind of life she actually wanted to live. She turned a corner, the towering buildings giving way to an open square. A street musician played a violin near a fountain, his music threading through the cool night air. A couple laughed nearby, their hands entwined. Life moved around her, unaware of the war waging in her chest. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, half expecting another late-night email or message about a deal in progress. Instead, it was Mason. "Mason, hope you didn't wander straight back to work. If you did, you owe me another coffee." She stared at the message, something unexpected twisting in her stomach. For so long she had kept people at a distance. Friendships, connections. Those were luxuries she had never dared to believe she could afford. But Mason was persistent. He had never asked for more than she was willing to give. Never pushed, never expected. Just remained. She hesitated for only a second before typing back, "Elena, I'm still outside. I think that means I win." The response came almost immediately. "Mason, barely. You still owe me coffee." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. For once, she let herself enjoy the moment. She wandered the streets a little longer before finally heading home. The city had long since become familiar, but the loneliness that sometimes crept into the quiet of her apartment was harder to shake. Tonight, though, it didn't feel as heavy. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, deadlines, and the ever-growing weight of success. Her firm had reached another milestone, landing a high-profile client that would solidify her place in the industry, the kind of deal she had once only dreamed of. She should have felt elated. Instead, she felt restless. She had done it. She had proven herself. So why did it still feel like she was waiting for something? One evening, as she sat in her office, staring at the skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, she realized the answer. She had spent so much time looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past to drag her back, that she had never truly stepped into her own future. Maybe it was time to change that. The thought lingered as she packed up for the night, her movements slower than usual. She wasn't sure where she was going when she left the office, only that she didn't want to go straight home. Her feet carried her to the university. The gates stood tall, unchanged from the first time she had stood in front of them, hesitant, unsure if she truly belonged. Now, years later, she walked through them with purpose. The campus was quiet in the late evening, students trickling out of buildings in pairs and small groups. The library lights still glowed in the distance. She had spent countless nights there, poring over textbooks, filling notebooks with knowledge she had once been denied. She had worked so hard to build something for herself. But what if there was more to life than just building? What if she could finally start living? She exhaled and turned back toward the street, her decision settling into place. The next morning she walked into her office and did something she had never done before. She cleared her schedule. Her assistant looked at her like she had gone insane. "Are you feeling all right?" Elena just smiled. "I think I'm finally starting to." She spent the day doing something unheard of. Nothing. She wandered the city, revisiting the places that had shaped her. The bookstore where she had bought her first books with her own money. The quiet cafe Mason had dragged her to. the small apartment she had once lived in before she could afford something better. And as the sun dipped below the skyline, she realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. Of the past, of the future, of not knowing exactly what came next. For the first time, she wasn't running. She was simply moving forward. And that, she decided, was enough. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Alina's journey was not just one of survival, but of transformation, of reclaiming her life, her choices, and her future. It is a reminder that no matter where we come from or what we have endured, we are not defined by our past. We are defined by what we choose to do next. Life is not about merely escaping hardship, but about deciding who we become beyond it. Strength is not just in endurance, but in knowing when to stop fighting and start living. And sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. The battle to believe that we are worthy of happiness, that we deserve more than just survival. Where are you watching from? We would love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to redefine your own path? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful stories like this to life. Thank you for being here. And remember, your story is still being written. Make it one worth telling.